The Mind's Eye with BJ Turnoff. It's available on iTunes, Pandora, Amazon, and all major platforms. Really appreciate you listening. Really appreciate you subscribing. Feed your head, engage your brain, and enter the Mind's Eye. You're now standing at the intersection of history and mystery, the center of science and the strange, and your source for the subliminal to the criminal. I'm DJ BJ Turnoff, host of this auditorium of audacity. Pretty great show planned for you tonight. We got a double shot of the weird and the wonderful, as you know we do. First part of the show is really going to suck, I'm not going to lie. It's going to be blood-suckingly good because we're going to dive into a topic that we haven't done before, and that's really because just really couldn't find a good approach to it until heard about this recent book. So we're going to talk about humans' fascination with the vampire myth, which stems much further back than the pop culture renditions that you're probably used to in comics, TV, and the like. Because stories of vampires or vampire-like creatures, they go back as far as the first civilizations. Dr. Kathryn Harkup, she comes back to the show. She's got a wicked sense of humor. She's going to share her investigations into how much of the vampire lore is based in fact, and if science can explain the origins of horror's most famous fiend. Some of the vampire characteristics: drinking blood to live forever, look young, an aversion to light, and the vampire vaccines, garlic and holy water. All of that obviously seems too fantastical to be real, but more often than not, you're going to find some kernel of truth behind that. Regardless of whether the living undead could or could not be real, studying these creatures and their legendary traits do have benefits, from new medical treatments to predicting the spread of disease and even delaying the signs of aging. Kathryn's going to talk about some of those advances and then also, of course, share famous and obscure vampire stories. I mean, how can we not talk about Bram Stoker's Dracula, but maybe you don't know about the OG story, The Vampire. And we'll also talk about quote-unquote real vampire stories from across the globe, including the infamous Vlad the Impaler, but maybe you don't know about his distant relative, the Blood Countess, and then we'll bring it up to today's real vampire, so to speak. Then after our Vampirology session, stay tuned for the second helping of the Mind's Eye, that double shot, because we're starting our trek to Contact in the Desert, the biggest UFO conference in the world, and in my opinion, the best one. Somehow it is next week, and because of the thou shall not be named pandemic, Contact in the Desert this year is virtual. Quite possibly this might actually be the only virtual Contact in the Desert ever, so it's going to be a special one, and because of that, it is going to be bigger and better than ever. They've really stuffed the lineup this year. I'm doing interviews with 3 of the speakers. You're going to hear that over the next week. The first one is tonight. Stephen A. Schwartz, one of the original remote viewers. He joins us. If you're not familiar with the concept of remote viewing, aka non-local perception, it's the ability to see distant targets just by using your mind, which is mind-blowing. It's a second sight. And, for those who might be rolling their eyes right now, you might not want to, because it is something that the CIA used in the past and may be still using today. Stephen A. Schwartz, he's going to give us a remote viewing 101 and then tease his lecture and workshop at the Contact in the Desert conference. More information about both guests and how to get tickets to Contact in the Desert is on our website, themindseyemedia.com. It is your one-stop shop for sure, because I got blogs up there inspired by pop culture with a history twist, free archives. I mean, we got 100 free episodes, if not closer to 120 free episodes by now. Links to social media where I post articles that I read throughout the week that I think are so fascinating that you got to read them, and so I post them up there. You could check it all out. Again, that's themindseyemedia.com. If you appreciate the content and the hard work that goes into it, please show a little support. Hit the donate button at the top of the website. Truly, really can't understand how much, one, I appreciate that and how much that keeps the show going. And as a way to say thank you, everyone who donates, they get at least a free episode never heard before on air. And the more you give, the more you get, like free books on past guests and related topics. So again, please hit the donate button at the top. So thank you for those who do donate. All right, now that that's done, let's get back to the good stuff. We're welcoming back Dr. Kathryn Harkup to the Mind's Eye. So nice to talk with you again, Doctor. Time flies. It's been a couple of years.
Yeah, it's very nice of you to invite me back. So thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure.
It has been a while.
Yeah, it's funny how time can fly that way, and you know, I guess that's kind of relevant to our topic tonight. We're talking about vampires and time flies and how they can take, how they survive a long time. And I imagine over the last 2 years, that's what you've been working on. Your new book, Vampirology or Vampirology. How do you pronounce it?
I pronounce it Vampirology, but I'm not even sure it's a proper word, so I think you can take your own punt on that one.
All right, well, I'm going to go with the author. So Vampirology, and that's my New Yorker part coming in there. Vampirology, the science of horror's most famous fiend. Really what the book is a thought experiment. You know, how much of the vampire lore is based on fact, and how can science explain the origins of the myth? Why did you take this topic and that approach?
Well, vampires have been kind of haunting me for a long, long time. For a couple of decades now, they've been, flitting around in my mind. I saw this amazing lecture. Oh, it must have been about the year 2000 or something. And it was this guy who's talking about a medical condition called porphyria. And he described how these people were very sensitive to sunlight, how they their symptoms coincided with a lot of the tropes that we know about vampires. And then he went on to talk about the chemistry involved in this particular medical condition. And I thought, well, that's all wrong. You shouldn't do the 5 minutes about vampires and the 50 minutes about chemistry. It should be the other way around. So I got interested and I did lots and lots of reading. And I realized that actually his theory is not that great. It's very unfair to people with porphyria, and it's not a particularly good explanation for vampires. But it was a really interesting way to engage people in science. You take something seemingly ridiculous like vampires, the blood-sucking undead who come back and terrorize the living. And then you go, well, okay, what if this is a real thing? What might we expect of these beings? How might they have come about? And when my job involved talking to lots of teenagers who hear the word science and immediately shut down, if you start talking about vampires, then they become interested. So it was a useful tool for me to talk about science in an unusual context.
What I appreciate, we're obviously, the Mind's Eye here, we're pretty strange and unusual, so we appreciate that approach. And that's what I really enjoyed about the book is kind of taking a serious look at a somewhat, wacky topic of sorts, at least considered today. And what I liked is that you built this foundation in that we know, scientifically speaking, that there is no single way for life to survive on Earth. And even today, we're still finding previous unknown species and civilizations. So that's a really strong foundation. So in your opinion, how absurd is it that, and I'm going to put it in the terms that you put it, Homo vampirus in some form walk amongst us?
I don't think it's that ridiculous. As a concept that there have been other species of Homo sapien, Homo erectus, Homo, etc., etc. And we have coexisted with these species or subspecies in the past. And if vampires had the traits that we often attribute to them, this longevity, they're pretty much indestructible, then theoretically, they could be among us in very, very small numbers, and they'd be quite difficult to single out. So it's not ridiculous in that sense, but it is ridiculous when you consider the traits that we do give to vampires. So the coexistence of another species, yep, I'm kind of down with that. But the coexistence of Homo vampirus, maybe not.
But we do know that vampire myths, tales, legends, they do date back to the earliest civilizations, or vampire-like legends, to the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and what are some of them? And there's been this evolution throughout time and up to today. So, what are some of the major differences and commonalities linking them, and what are the changes in society that reflect those differences?
Well, in the very sort of earliest incarnations of vampire-like creatures. I mean, they would never have been described as vampires. That word didn't exist. They were supernatural beings, demons of some sort. They were the restless undead, and they were a very useful way of explaining the spread of disease, sudden deaths within a family or a village. And so they were a useful, maybe, metaphor for explaining the world around people when they had no idea of germ theory and the spread of disease and things like that. So they had certain characteristics. They weren't very nice creatures. They were quite recognizable. They had quite a disgusting appearance, and they preyed on the living. Then the kind of next evolution in vampire or Homo vampirus was around the 18th century. So in the early 1720s-ish, there was a huge spate of vampirism in Central Europe. People, it was almost plague-like back in the day. And there were stories of people coming back from the dead and, dozens of people within a village being struck down by this horrible creature that would creep into their room in the middle of the night and suck the life from them. And it was terrifying. But again, it was a way of perhaps explaining the sudden appearance of a very rapidly spreading disease. And when the bodies were exhumed to examine these corpses for signs of being a vampire, they would show what were thought to be unusual decay within the body, or no apparent decay. Now, today we can explain away these things. It might have been unusual, but that didn't mean it was unnatural. But again, they had no kind of germ theory. So again, vampires kind of served a purpose of explaining the world around people at that time. Then, of course, fiction got involved. And a wonderful man called John William Polidori wrote a short story called The Vampire and set off a craze because this vampire was pale, good-looking, aristocratic, and this vampire had sex appeal. And people just took this theme and absolutely ran with it to where we are today with all kinds of vampire-like creatures on our screens. So today, I think they feel very much a need for, I don't know, a bit of mystery, a bit of a kind of a safe scare in a cinema or in a book. And they're usually very good looking. They live forever. They have no disease. I mean, it's quite an attractive lifestyle if you can overlook the murdering and the blood-sucking.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic also because vampires today, modern vampires, are looked at sexy and one of the lenses that you looked at, as you mentioned, was vampirism as a disease. And it's kind of funny because vampirism, something mentioned in the book, was a good model for STDs and the spread of that population. So it's almost ironic that the modern vampire is depicted as sexy, yet it's like the perfect model for STDs.
Oh, absolutely. It is, this creeping thing that comes in the middle of the night. It's all, to do with illicit assignations and all kinds of stuff that would have absolutely thrilled the Victorians and horrified them at the same time. You can see why they kind of jumped on this particular metaphor in their fiction. But yeah, I think we've taken it to extremes today, which vampires seem to be very good at adapting to the needs of their environment around them.
As you said, like vampirism as a disease can help explain it. That was one lens that you looked at, and then the lack of scientific understanding. And it's kind of funny that at that time, that shift when you talked about that explosion in Europe, how around that time, in response, there was trying to take a serious approach, at least looking at a rational explanation for vampires. And that was, of all people, done by a father or a reverend, I believe.
Yes, this wonderful priest in France, I think it was. This was the Enlightenment. So apart from all of these strange happenings in Central Europe, there was an awful lot of people, particularly in Europe, but also in America and other parts of the world, who suddenly became very, very interested in the world around them and sought scientific explanations for those things. And absolutely anything was up for grabs. So, there were people doing very important work in electricity and chemistry and engineering and all sorts of things. But there were also people who were looking at, hey, ghosts, hey, vampires, let's take a serious look at this. And why the hell not? The conclusions they came to were very interesting, particularly from a priest's point of view, because he saw this. He was actually quite rational in his approach. It's like, well, okay, if these people really did see this, can we try and explain it? And he didn't always have the answers, but he never really condemned the people that saw them or, the existence of these vampires. So he got into a lot of trouble with his bosses. But he also wrote this magnificent tome that absolutely flew off the shelves. It was a bestseller because everyone wanted to know about these blood-sucking demons and stories that were coming in from Eastern Europe. So, he had a go. He tried to think of how maybe a body could escape the grave without disturbing the soil and didn't really come up with very much. Tried to explain how... thought maybe there was a religious explanation that somehow these dead bodies were becoming possessed by demons or the devil himself. Absolutely anything was up for grabs, and why the hell not? It's just a question of sifting through all of this information, investigation and thought to what actually has a basis in fact.
Yeah, it's almost like the modern template for, various ranges of paranormal investigation. And so in response to this huge explosion in European tales of vampires and stories coming out, you got that one side where we're going to take this serious approach, at least try and get a rational explanation for it. And then, of course, on anytime something of great interest, interest generates large amounts of people, there's always going to be the opposite side of that where there's fraud. For example, at least one thing that I took away from the book was that it wasn't necessarily talked about, but more of alluded that, in response to this European vampire problem, it produced its own slayers, almost like these original Blades from Marvel Comics. Anyone, the Dampiers.
Yeah.
So, did you think they were
wonderful.
fraud? Like, did you think those were fraud? I mean, they had to be fraud,
absolutely.
Obviously. Yeah.
At least some of them had to be frauds. I mean, there may have been some of them who genuinely believed what they were doing was real and that they were battling with these invisible supernatural creatures. But when you read the accounts of what they did, they just wandered into a village, said, yep, you've got a vampire problem, give us some cash and I'll sort it for you. I mean, that's a scam. It's yeah. So I'm sure there were all sorts of people trying to make money off the back of vampires, as people still are, just in slightly different ways.
Yeah, I wonder if the kind of the Blade story was at least partially inspired by these European Dampiers, these half human, half vampire parents. And right before that, you mentioned how we were talking about the modern vampire characteristics, and that was, as you mentioned, was born from Polidori, the author of The Vampire, who obviously had to have a big influence on Bram Stoker's Dracula, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, pretty much from Polidori, you can draw a straight line to Dracula through artists through books like Carmilla and Varney the Vampire, which is a romping good read, but very, very long and quite repetitive. So, get through the first 20, 40 chapters if you dare. But yeah, it's a straight line up to Dracula. And then, of course, not long after Dracula was released on the world, there were theatre productions, and then of course there was film, an early film, black and white film. This is the perfect medium for vampires. All of those really dark shadows and really bright lights. It's no wonder that they took off and reached a huge audience, and the rest, as they say, is kind of history.
And that harkens back to our initial conversation a couple of years ago when we talked about Frankenstein, and those two of the most influential horror stories of all time were created on the same night in the same trip.
Oh, yeah, the same night. It's incredible. 5 people locked in a room, bored out of their minds because it won't stop raining, and probably used up all of their opium reserves. And what the hell are we going to do now? They tell each other ghost stories. There's 2 very well-established writers in the room, Lord Byron and Percy Shelley, and neither of them really come up with anything. It's Mary Shelley who comes up with Frankenstein out of a conversation about dead beings, being brought back to life, and the nature of life itself. And there's lightning storms outside. You can kind of see where that came from. And then John Polidori, who was Lord Byron's doctor and travelling companion, came up with this pale, aristocratic, predatory vampire that was an awful lot like his boss. So you can kind of see where that inspiration came from as well. But yeah, one night and two instantly recognizable figures from the horror genre were born. It's incredible.
And of course, like all great artists, or not like all great artists, but some great artists, there's a bit of a sad ending. Polidori, the author of The Vampire, didn't really get that recognition and committed suicide a couple years later, right?
Yeah, he was not known as a writer. He was a very accomplished doctor, graduated very young. And this short story, because it was so much like Lord Byron, everyone just assumed that Lord Byron had written it. And so he had to kind of fight quite hard to get the recognition. I think he got paid £30, like in retrospect, when he finally managed to prove that he'd written it. And he had a very sad life. He wanted to be a writer, and he didn't succeed. And he sadly ended things with some cyanide when he was, I think he was still in his 20s. It was all very tragic.
And like there's one, there's the other story within the story was for Bram Stoker, Dracula, and that, so you have this fictional inspiration, and then you have the real life influence for him, and that was the infamous Vlad the Impaler, Dracula from the 15th century. I mean, was he really as bad as they say?
I think he was quite bad by modern standards, by contemporary standards. I think he was, closer to par for the course. He was. I think it depends on where you're born as well, and if he's fighting on your side. I wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of Vlad the Impaler. That seems like an extraordinarily bad idea. He was very severe in his punishment, and there wasn't much room for negotiation. So if you broke any rule, basically there was only one punishment, and you were going to be impaled on a stake. And left outside as a warning to everybody else. And it was remarkably effective, as you might imagine.
Yeah, I can imagine, or I don't really want to imagine walking up to seeing that sight. I'd definitely put my tail between my legs and go the other side for sure. And kind of something that's left out of that story, or at least something that obviously Christians aren't really bragging about, is that he was killing in the name of Christianity, and that,
absolutely,
his name, then at least, and his family emblem, the dragon, I mean, they weren't really associated with the devil or evil.
Well, yeah, the emblem of the dragon it's now very much assumed, he was taking on the emblem of the devil to show that he was on the devil's side. No. He was fighting against the devil. This was the Order of the Dragon, supposedly to defend Christian Europe against those terrible Turks that bordered Vlad's land. And so, yeah, he slaughtered thousands of Muslims in the most horrific manner. It's absolutely brutal. But yeah, he was considered a hero at the time.
Yeah, that's kind of part of the story that's left out, or at least not highlighted as much as it probably should be. And I think that I think if we're going to nominate for the most messed up family of all time, I think the Draculas would have to take it, right? Because one other person, or one other supposed vampire mentioned in the book, was a distant relative of Vlad Dracula who lived about a century after him, the Blood Countess. Would you say her nickname was? Her nickname was well earned, or was she misunderstood?
I think, again, a bit like Vlad, she probably gets a lot of bad press from her enemies. However, she was not a nice person, would not like to get on the wrong side of her. I don't want to completely absolve her of all her crimes, because clearly she committed crimes. Quite what they were, and no one, I think, is ever going to know now, but certainly crimes were committed, almost certainly not on the scale of the 600 deaths that she is claimed to have carried out, and in quite gruesome manner. So you can see where reputation builds, and she earns this name of the Blood Countess, and she apparently had an obsession with blood. She thought it kept her looking young and beautiful, but I mean, God, she hasn't been the first or the last person to think that. So yeah, I do think she gets a bit of a bad press, but again, not a nice person.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't want to cross her as well.
No.
If I had to choose between one of the two, I'd probably just kill myself. But
invites to Vlad's or Elizabeth Bathory's home for dinner. No, I think I'm going to be washing my hair. I'd find an excuse not to be there.
Yeah, some of the things she was accused of was pretty horrible, and so I imagine the truth is somewhere in between, really.
Yeah.
And what I love when prepping for interviews and reading books is that you always pick up these little tidbits that are related to the story, but not necessarily part of the story. And one thing that I loved about your book was talking about how there was this huge reverence for blood's healing properties, and that it was common in the 16th century treatment for seizures was to drink the fresh blood of an executed criminal. So people used to rush out to the scaffold to place cups and bowls on a wooden platform to catch the blood, or even dip a handkerchief in it. In your research, what was one of your favorite tidbits that you picked up along the way?
Oh, it was one of the favorite vampire stories that I came across. Was the story, is one of the first that's really documented. It was from Greece. And there was this story of a vampire. A man died, or his body was discovered. And so they hastily buried this chap because no one really liked him. So they hastily buried him. A few days later, people are being woken up at night with sort of, bangings on their door, and, people are putting their lights out and just generally being annoying. And so they blame this chap that died a few days earlier and say, oh, it's him. He's come back to annoy us because we didn't give him proper burial rites because we didn't like him. And it escalated to almost farcical details. And it was clearly, well, in my opinion, what do I know? I was not around in 17, whenever it was when it happened in Greece. It just seems to me like there was a bunch of kids just being a general pain and just antagonizing the locals, and everyone's like, nope, it's the dead guy. It's definitely the dead guy. We need to perform all of these elaborate rituals. Then we're going to dig him up. We're going to cut out his heart. No, that's not enough. We're going to burn him. And it's the stuff of very black comedy. I love that story.
Yeah, that's a great one. And some of the other funny ones, I think there was like a vampire watermelon, right?
Yes, apparently vampire watermelons exist. If you leave them out in the sun too long, they will come and annoy you. I don't think they're particularly life-threatening. They're just annoying. Yeah, vampire watermelons. Who knew?
Yeah, there's a lot of little funny little parts in the book, and but let's talk a little bit more about the scientific aspect of it and the relationship to some of the characteristics given to vampires, because there's a lot of interesting things that I think people probably may not be as familiar with that. So let's kind of start with the biggest one is that vampires need to drink blood to stay alive, which also kind of gives them their youthful appearance. But blood drinking isn't really unique to vampires. Animals do it. There's food that uses blood for humans, like black pudding. So talk a little bit about the qualities of blood and in particular that its healing properties.
Well, there have been some really interesting studies into blood, and blood transfusions clearly save lives. There is no doubt over that. Thousands of people every single month owe their lives to a very rapid blood transfusion. So please donate blood. It's a good thing to do. But what is interesting is people who've done studies into giving different types of blood, and I don't mean AO or AB. I mean a young person's blood versus an older person's blood. And there's some studies with mice, and it's a bit gruesome, but they basically stitched two mice together so that they shared a blood supply. One mouse was quite young and one mouse was getting on a bit in mouse years. And they found that the elderly mouse kind of got a bit perkier. The fur got shinier and it responded better generally. It appeared to be healthier. So people started to speculate, well, maybe there is some life-giving property within blood. And so now people are on the hunt for whatever it might be within our blood because this appears on the face of it to apply to humans as well. Younger blood can give your immune system a bit of a boost. You heal faster. You maybe feel a bit better. How much of that is psychological, I don't know. But yeah, blood is amazing stuff. So maybe vampires are onto something. What I can't recommend is drinking it, because that's going to the wrong part of your body. That's just going to get digested. Also, consent. Please don't just go out there and start drinking people's blood. Make sure that they're, happy to do this. But that being said, blood is extraordinary stuff. Maybe we should be eating more black pudding and haggis.
You don't recommend people drinking the blood, but then there are sanguinarians who enjoy drinking blood, and then as well as clinical vampirism mentioned in the book, of people who have a compulsion to drink blood. So, I say this next statement truly without judgment in any way, and just really wanting to understand more than anything. So kind of like what's going on with psychologically there with people like that.
I honestly don't know. I've had email conversations with people who, they are looking for the answers, I think, perhaps as much as we are. But there are people who have a compulsion, and not necessarily a compulsion to feel blood, but to drink blood, but they feel better after they have drunk blood. And if they don't get a regular, usually quite a very small amount, they feel unwell, they feel tired, lethargic, they feel sensitive to sunlight. It sounds to me like a kind of addiction, but addiction is an incredibly complex phenomenon. It's not just necessarily there is a chemical within blood that is, triggering reward pathways in their brain, which is what happens with things like heroin and nicotine. That's why you go back for more. Your body's telling you, yep, this is a good thing. Do more of this. As far as I'm aware, there's nothing in blood that would trigger that physiological response. But then there are, there are habits we all fall into, things that we enjoy doing that have no rational explanation or benefit to our well-being, but we feel good when we do them. So I honestly don't know, and I don't know how much of a study there has been into it, because it seems to me quite a rare phenomenon, or maybe it's just not widely talked about. I don't know.
An example of that, I guess, would be vampire facials. We don't probably know that they work, but the rich love them, right? Because supposedly it's going to keep you looking young. Anything to do that, right?
Well, yeah, I think all of us would be, swayed slightly by the promise of looking younger. Or there's also that thing of, if you put a high enough price tag on something, you're going to appreciate it all the more. And I'm sure vampire facials don't come cheap. So, if you pay out enough money, whatever you're getting in return must be worth it, right? So there's all of those kind of reassurances. But yeah, like I say, it's a really complicated thing. And if there are any studies out there that people know of, I would love to read them, because it's fascinating.
I'm 39, but I think I claim that I'm either aging like wine or cheese, and I can't really tell which one's which. But so you said, obviously we would all want to keep looking young, but what about another characteristic, living for eternity? Is that something that you would want to do?
Me personally, no, I don't think so. I'm slightly older than you. I'm not going to admit to quite how many years older.
No revealing. You plead the fifth.
But yeah, I find many things in the world baffling, and I'm sure that bafflement is going to increase with age. And I can only imagine that after 400 years, or however many years Dracula has been on this earth, that everything is just utterly bewildering, and that doesn't sound like fun.
Or boring, I guess, at that point. Either way, it's a lose-lose. Absolutely.
Or you've absolutely seen everything there is under the sun. You've read every book that you want to read. You've watched every TV show that you want to watch. You've got to the end of Netflix. What is there left? So I'm not sure I'd want eternal life. It sounds great, but I think the reality is probably quite dull.
Yeah, if you can
Especially
live.
if you've got to sleep in a coffin for like 12 hours a day. I think I'll pass.
Yeah, that doesn't sound so great. Although, quite frankly, when I sleep, I've been called a vampire when I do sleep because the most common way I fall asleep is on my back with, kind of my hands on my chest, almost mummy and vampire like. And then I also have to have blacked out curtains in my bedroom, and also sleep with a face mask, or at least when the first crack of dawn comes in, I have to put a sleep mask on. So am I going to turn into a vampire? Because we know they have like a well aversion of sun rays, right?
Well, I mean, how rare do you have your steaks? It's
Bloody as hell, for sure.
maybe you're on a slippery slope. Who knows?
So where does like the aversion from sun rays come from?
Well, oh, spoiler alert! It's all from one film. I love this characteristic, and I've talked about vampires in front of dozens of audiences, and there's always that moment of everyone knows to their very core that vampires are killed by sunlight, and then you absolutely ruin it for them at the end of the talk. So I'm going to ruin it for you. It's one film. In 1922, the brilliant film Nosferatu, do track it down. There are copyright-free versions out there that you can just download and watch, and it's a fantastic piece of silent black and white cinema. And it's basically a complete rip-off of Dracula, to the extent that Bram Stoker's widow, sued. But this film has the Count, or Nosferatu, they carefully changed his name. Right at the end, he's been promised the Mina Harker character as his reward. And so he creeps into her bedroom, fantastic shadow work all along. There's hands creeping along walls and up staircases, brilliant stuff. And he finally feeds on Mina Harker, and then he hears the cock crow, and he probably thinks, well, I haven't seen a sunrise in a few centuries, I'll go and have a look out the window. So he walks over to the window in the cheesiest piece of acting you'll ever see. And he turns around, and as the light falls on him, in a most fantastic special effect for 1922, he disappears. And this was like the selling point for the film in 1922. It looks rubbish now because special effects have moved on, but it was brilliant at the time. And it became such an iconic moment that from then on, basically all vampires are killed by sunlight. It's incredible, the influence of film, and just one film in particular.
And then also, before that one book, Bram Stoker's Dracula, kind of the same thing for bats. That becomes inextricably linked. Retroactively speaking, that also kind of builds into your idea that vampirism as a disease, because we know bats can give you rabies, and that's also another possible explanation, or somebody gave, for the phenomenon of vampires.
Absolutely, and I think it's a much more credible theory than a lot of the other ones that I've read. The coincidence of vampire characteristics and rabies symptoms, there are some coincidences between the two. And this disease that can, after you get bitten by, it's usually dogs that transmit rabies, but bats can transmit it. And bats can be quite bitey. They don't really like humans. Leave them well alone. I don't know about in the States, but in the UK, all bats are protected. Leave them be. They're great. Bats are awesome. Don't mess with bats. They're cool.
Yeah, and I like Batman, so I'll second that as well.
Bats genuinely awesome creatures because they have this most fantastic immune system. They can be flying around with the most horrible diseases and they're just fine. The problem is when bats come into contact with humans, and they can pass on these diseases because we just frankly have very poor immune systems in comparison, and we just can't fight them off. And one of those diseases is rabies. So you can be bitten by some creature that has rabies. The virus goes into your body and it makes slow progress through your nervous system, and it ends up in your brain. So all the time it's traveling along your nerves, basically you're fine. You forget about the bite mark because that's healed over, and then all of a sudden these very strange and very distressing symptoms appear. You become hypersensitive to things like strong flavors like garlic, bright lights, and you become absolutely terrified of the sight of water, whether it's holy or straight out the tap. So you can see how some of these characteristics overlap with vampire characteristics, but it's just, and there were major outbreaks of rabies in Central Europe around the time that they were having those epidemics that we talked about earlier. So it all kind of quite neatly ties in, but there are a few kind of, yeah, I'm not so sure. Particularly because even in the 1720s, people would have known what rabies was and what the rabies symptoms were and the likely outcome, which was death, unfortunately. And these people very specifically talk about the fact that these people had died and been buried and then came back. So there are some major sort of stumbling blocks in the rabies theory, but a fascinating disease and a truly horrible one that still affects large parts of the world even today, with quite devastating effects on the human population and cattle, etc. So that was a fascinating investigation into rabies and their possible connection with vampires.
Yeah, whether the rabies vampire connection is true, you can probably at least make a strong case for the relationship because some of the things that you mentioned, garlic and water, that you become, I guess, afraid of when you have rabies, that is also associated with vampire vaccines and vampire prevention. So I think you can make definitely a case for it, for sure.
Yeah, like I say, I think it is definitely one of the better theories that have been put forward. But yeah, I've done my best to be sensible, as sensible as you can be when you're writing about the blood-sucking undead, to look at these theories and on their merits, not just today. The problem is we are burdened with our baggage of film vampires, and as we've said, they've gone off on a weird tangent.
Perfect transition segue, because I want to talk about that, because I found myself laughing a bunch of times at your book. You really are, really funny, and you got a lot of comical parts in it. So you mentioned, I think, once or twice about a show called What We Do in the Shadows, which is a mix of, I guess, The Office and vampires. So I decided, screw it, I'm going to just start watching it because it was so, I found the book so funny, I wanted to keep it going. I think my favorite characters is the energy vampire. He's hilarious. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with the book, with the TV series. But one of those, there's this thing called energy vampires. I mean, they got to be real, right? I mean, I have been around one, and they are real, right?
Oh yeah. I've met some of those as well. Again, the vampire kind of tag suits those people that can just being in their presence drains you of everything. And it is the vampire metaphor is such a good one for those people. It's got nothing to do with coming back from the dead and drinking blood, all of those other characteristics that we associate with vampires, but as a kind of subspecies of a vampire, it's a little too on the nose sometimes. Yeah.
And another character I guess it probably also in the film as well, but in the TV series, there's someone called it's a Vampirology, someone that you talked about, a person who aspires to be a vampire, and that connects to a real life organization in the name of vampirism, the Temple of the Vampire that you mentioned, who talk about how that's vampires is the next step in human evolution. I mean, have you ever met one of these people from the organization, or someone claiming to be a real vampire, or someone trying to be a vampire, obviously?
I've spent a fair amount of time with some, very pale people who wear a lot of black. But, that's a stylistic choice. That's nothing necessarily, I don't think they weren't looking at my neck that much. So again, it's where do you draw these boundaries? Vampires are such adaptable creatures that they fit into all these different niches. So I've never knowingly met someone who believes or aspires to be a vampire. I have, as I said, I've had online email conversations with sanguinarians, which is a very different thing. Sanguinarians don't necessarily associate themselves with vampirism. They have no need to, for all the clothes, etc. They just like drinking blood or having their blood drunk. So it's there's all kinds of weird subcategories. So I've never met any of these people, but I mean, why? Like I said earlier, why wouldn't you want to be a vampire? You know, they look great because dark clothes. Okay, fine, not flattering to everyone, but they're always really sharp, really well cut, nicely tailored, and wanting to live forever and look beautiful. Why not? That's not a bad aspiration.
Yeah, I guess here's my problem with the logic of wanting to become a vampire. You got to drink their blood, but I guess depending on what part of the world and culture that you're in, drinking the blood can either turn you into a vampire or stop you from becoming one.
Yes. So from this sort of TV side of things, this whole kind of mutual blood sucking thing. So if Dracula drinks your blood, but you then drink his blood, that's it. It's inevitable you're going to become a vampire. Whereas in the past, drinking vampire blood was kind of a preventative. So there was a famous vampire case, Arnold Pole, I think his name is pronounced. I probably got that completely wrong. But he was attacked by a vampire, allegedly. So this is 1725, around then. So he tracked down the vampire to his grave, dug this vampire up, ate some of the soil from the grave, and drank and washed himself in the blood of the vampire. And this was to prevent him from also turning it into a vampire. And that kind of tradition has carried on until quite recent times as a cure for unwanted vampirism, shall we say, because obviously some people want this, but unwanted vampirism. So yeah, it's vampirism is full of contradictions and weirdness and dissociated things. It's incredible that we happily dress kids as vampires, but they're really not nice creatures if you think of all the blood-sucking and the dead things and the disease things and the murdering side of things. But, they look good in an opera cape, so why not?
So last book, Frankenstein. This one we got vampires. I don't think there's any of the influential horror stories that were born from that night left for you to talk about or write about, or unless I'm wrong. What's next? And then also give out your social media before I let you go.
Oh, okay. At the moment, I'm not talking. I think I have exorcised all of those horror demons. I think I'm done with them. At the moment, I am working on the science of James Bond, which is a bit of a left turn for me. But it's all good fun. And I've got a book coming out later this year all about the periodic table and some interesting stories about the elements. So it's quite an eclectic bunch of things that I've been reading about the past year or so.
All right, so my first question on our next interview is going to be shaken or stirred, which is better,
yeah.
Obviously.
I'm going to, as a teetotaler, I am totally avoiding that.
All right, damn you. All right, well, give out your social media and then I'll let you go. Or anything you want to promote.
You can find me on Twitter and say hi. I'm at Rotwang's Robot, which is another Frankenstein link if you can figure that one out.
Dr. Kathryn Harkup, she was just talking about Vampirology, the science of horror's most famous fiend. Kathryn, Dr. Harkup, I'm just going to say all three in mixed up, jumbled way. I really appreciate your time so much.
Thank you so much. That was great fun.